I never thought a piece of paper from 1923 would save my farm, but there I was, standing in the county courthouse with my great-grandfather's will in one hand and a stack of HOA violation notices in the other. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I waited for my name to be called, knowing that everything my family had built over the past century was about to be decided by a judge who probably thought organic farming was just a fancy way to charge more for vegetables. But Margaret Worthington, the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek Estates, had no idea what she'd gotten herself into when she decided my 100-year-old farm was an eyesore that needed to be brought into compliance with community standards. It started 6 months ago when Margaret moved into the brand new development that sprouted up around my property like mushrooms after rain. She arrived in a white Mercedes SUV with custom license plates that read Perfect 1, and immediately began her campaign to turn our quiet rural area into her personal vision of suburban paradise. Margaret was the type of woman who wore designer athleisure to grocery shop and treated every conversation like a boardroom presentation. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her nails were always manicured, and she had this way of looking at you like you were a problem that needed solving. Within 2 weeks of moving in, she'd gotten herself elected as president of the newly formed Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, promising to elevate property values and maintain community excellence. The first sign of trouble came when Margaret knocked on my door on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She introduced herself as the neighborhood's community standards coordinator and explained that she was conducting a comprehensive property assessment to ensure everyone was contributing to the area's aesthetic cohesion. I invited her in for coffee, thinking she was just being neighborly, but Margaret had other plans. She spent the next 30 minutes walking around my property, taking pictures and making notes while explaining how my rustic structures were negatively impacting the visual harmony of the neighborhood. She pointed to my grandfather's hand-built red barn, the chicken coop my father had constructed in the 70s, and the old stone well that had been drawing water for our family since the farm was established. Each structure, she informed me, would need to be updated or removed to meet the new community guidelines. I explained to Margaret that my family had been farming this land since 1923, long before her development existed, but she waved my concerns away like she was swatting flies. She told me that times change, and that everyone needs to adapt to progress. Before leaving, she handed me a thick packet of papers outlining the Willow Creek Estates community standards and architectural guidelines, along with a preliminary violation notice for my non-conforming agricultural structures and inadequate landscaping maintenance. The packet was professionally printed with color photographs of approved fence styles, paint colors, and landscaping options, all of which looked like they belonged in a magazine rather than rural farming country. Margaret explained that I had 30 days to submit a compliance plan or face escalating fines and potential legal action. That evening, I called my neighbor, Tom Richardson, whose family had owned the adjacent property for almost as long as mine. Tom was 82 years old, with hands like leather and a memory that stretched back to when our grandfathers used to share equipment during harvest season. He listened to my story while shaking his head and muttering about city people who don't understand country ways. Tom told me that Margaret had visited him too, demanding that he remove his grandfather's old grain silo because it was an industrial eyesore in a residential area. When Tom pointed out that his property was zoned agricultural, Margaret had smiled and said that zoning classifications can be changed with proper community support and legal pressure. The next morning, I drove to the county planning office to research exactly what authority this HOA actually had over my property. The clerk, a helpful woman named Sarah who'd grown up in the area, pulled up the property records and development plans for Willow Creek Estates. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The development company had filed a petition to rezone the entire area from agricultural to residential, claiming that the scattered farms were incompatible with planned community development, and that consolidation would maximize land use efficiency and property values. Margaret's signature was on the petition as a community representative, along with signatures from dozens of other residents who supported the rezoning effort. If the petition was approved, My farm would be subject to residential building codes and HOA regulations, effectively forcing me to tear down everything my family had built or face massive fines and legal action. I spent the next week researching HOA law and property rights, staying up late reading legal websites, and calling property rights attorneys. What I learned was both encouraging and terrifying. While HOAs couldn't simply force existing property owners to comply with new regulations, they could make life extremely difficult through selective enforcement, legal challenges, and political pressure. Several attorneys told me that fighting an HOA required significant financial resources and legal expertise, and even then, the outcome was never guaranteed. One lawyer suggested that I might be better off selling my property to a developer and moving somewhere else, but the thought of abandoning my family's legacy made me sick to my stomach. 2 weeks after Margaret's visit, I received my first official violation notice in the mail. The letter, printed on expensive stationery with the Willow Creek Estates logo, informed me that my property was in violation of 17 different community standards, including inappropriate agricultural structures, non-conforming fencing, excessive livestock odors, and inadequate property maintenance. Each violation carried a fine of $50 per day until corrected, with the potential for additional penalties and legal action if compliance wasn't achieved within 60 days. The letter was signed by Margaret Worthington in flowing script, with a postscript noting that she was committed to helping all residents achieve community excellence. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to address these violations directly. The meeting was held in the community center of Willow Creek Estates, a gleaming building with marble floors and crystal chandeliers that looked more like a luxury hotel than a neighborhood meeting space. About 30 residents attended, most of them newcomers who'd moved to the area in the past year. Margaret presided over the meeting like a corporate executive, wearing a navy blue blazer and referring to a leather-bound agenda. When I stood up to speak during the public comment period, the room fell silent. I explained my family's history in the area and questioned the authority of the HOA to regulate property that predated the development by decades. Margaret listened with a patronizing smile before responding that established residents need to understand that community standards apply to everyone equally. She explained that property values in the area had increased by 30% since the HOA was established, and that maintaining these standards benefits everyone, including long-term residents who will see increased equity in their properties. When I pointed out that my property was zoned agricultural and had been in continuous farming use for a century, Margaret consulted her notes and informed the group that agricultural zoning is under review by the County Planning Commission and that transitional properties would be expected to comply with community standards during the rezoning process. After the meeting, I was approached by several residents who privately expressed sympathy for my situation. An elderly couple named Bob and Helen Martinez had lived in the area for 15 years and remembered when it was all farmland and rural homes. Helen told me that Margaret had been pressuring them to remove their vegetable garden because it was inappropriate for a residential neighborhood, even though they'd been growing their own food since before the development existed. Bob mentioned that Margaret had filed complaints about their grandson's pickup truck being parked in their driveway, claiming it was commercial equipment that violated community standards. They felt trapped by the HOA but were afraid to speak out because Margaret had threatened to pursue legal action against anyone who undermined community standards. The violations continued to pile up over the next month. Margaret seemed to drive by my property daily, documenting every perceived infraction with her phone camera. I received citations for having hay bales visible from the road, for my tractor being parked in the front yard, for the chickens making excessive noise, and for the general agricultural appearance of my property. The daily fines were adding up quickly, and Margaret had made it clear that she intended to pursue legal action if I didn't comply with her demands. She even brought in a lawyer from the city who specialized in HOA enforcement, a sharp-dressed man who sent me a letter threatening to place a lien on my property if the violations weren't corrected immediately. That's when I decided to fight back, but not in the way Margaret expected. Instead of hiring an expensive attorney or trying to negotiate with the HOA, I went to my grandmother's old cedar chest in the attic, where she'd kept family documents and photographs dating back to the early 1900s. I'd been through these papers many times over the years, but I'd never paid close attention to the legal documents. This time, I spread everything out on the kitchen table and began reading carefully. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, and tax records told the story of my family's connection to this land. But it was my great-grandfather's will, written in 1923, that caught my attention. The will was handwritten in faded ink on legal paper, signed by my great-grandfather Samuel Morrison and witnessed by 2 neighbors. Most of it dealt with the division of property and possessions among his children, but there was a clause near the end that made my heart race. Great-grandfather Samuel had established what he called a perpetual agricultural easement on the property, stipulating that the land must remain in agricultural use for the benefit of future generations and the preservation of rural character. The easement was recorded with the county and included specific language protecting the property from residential development, industrial use, or any other purpose that would interfere with agricultural operations. According to the will, any attempt to change the agricultural character of the property would result in the land reverting to the county for use as a public agricultural preserve. I immediately took the will to the county recorder's office, where Sarah helped me research the legal status of the easement. What we discovered was remarkable. The easement was still valid and legally binding, having been properly recorded and maintained through property tax payments for over a century. More importantly, the easement took precedence over any HOA regulations, zoning changes, or development plans. The county legal department confirmed that the agricultural easement could not be overridden by HOA regulations, and that any attempt to force non-agricultural use of the property would be illegal. They also noted that the easement included specific protections for traditional agricultural structures and operations, which meant my barn, chicken coop, and farming activities were explicitly protected under the law. Armed with this information, I requested a meeting with Margaret and the HOA board. We met in Margaret's living room, which looked like a furniture showroom with white leather couches, abstract art, and not a single personal photograph or lived-in touch. Margaret arrived wearing a cream-colored suit and carrying a leather portfolio, clearly expecting to present me with a settlement offer or compliance agreement. The 3 board members who attended were all recent arrivals to the area, successful professionals who'd moved to Willow Creek Estates for the quiet rural setting but wanted urban amenities and standards. They listened politely as Margaret reviewed my violations and outlined the financial penalties that had accumulated. When it was my turn to speak, I placed a copy of my great-grandfather's will on Margaret's glass coffee table and explained the agricultural easement. I watched Margaret's confident expression slowly change as she read the document and realized its implications. The board members asked several questions about the easement's legal status, which I answered by showing them the county legal department's written opinion confirming its validity. Margaret tried to argue that the easement was outdated and incompatible with modern community standards, but I explained that perpetual easements were designed to be permanent and could only be changed through lengthy legal proceedings that would likely fail, given the strong legal protections for agricultural land use. Margaret's composure finally cracked when I mentioned that I'd also discovered her rezoning petition contained several false statements about my property's agricultural status. The petition claimed that my farm was inactive and not in commercial agricultural use, but my tax records clearly showed continuous agricultural production and sales for the past century. I'd also found out that Margaret had been telling potential buyers in the development that my property would be converted to residential use within 2 years, a claim that was both false and potentially fraudulent, given the agricultural easement protections. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances as they realized Margaret had been making promises she couldn't keep and potentially exposing the HOA to legal liability. The meeting ended with Margaret storming out, declaring that she would pursue every legal option available to force compliance with community standards. But her threats rang hollow now that I had legal protection for my farming operations. Over the next few days, I received several angry phone calls from Margaret, demanding that I be reasonable and consider the impact on property values. She even offered to pay for aesthetic improvements to my property if I would agree to tone down the agricultural appearance. I politely declined her offers and reminded her that the agricultural easement required me to maintain the property's farming character. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from Margaret's attorney, withdrawing all violation notices and acknowledging that my property was protected by a valid agricultural easement. The letter also included a formal apology for any inconvenience caused by the HOA's actions and a check reimbursing me for the fines I'd paid. But Margaret wasn't finished. She began a campaign to pressure the County Planning Commission to override the agricultural easement through eminent domain proceedings, claiming that my farm was preventing orderly development and hindering community growth. She organized a petition drive among Willow Creek Estates residents and even hired a consulting firm to prepare a report arguing that agricultural easements were economically inefficient and contrary to modern land use planning. Margaret's campaign backfired spectacularly when local newspapers picked up the story. The headlines were brutal. HOA president tries to seize century-old farm and development company attempts to override agricultural easement. The articles portrayed Margaret as an outsider trying to destroy rural heritage and traditional farming, while I was presented as a defender of agricultural tradition and property rights. Letters to the editor poured in supporting my position, including several from local farmers who dealt with similar pressure from development companies. The County Planning Commission received hundreds of comments opposing Margaret's petition, and several commissioners publicly stated that they would not support any attempt to override the agricultural easement. The controversy reached its peak when Margaret made the mistake of confronting me publicly at the county fair. I was manning my family's booth, selling produce and talking with customers, when Margaret approached with a small group of supporters from Willow Creek Estates. She began loudly complaining about my stubborn refusal to cooperate with community improvement efforts and claimed that my farm was holding back progress and property values. What Margaret didn't realize was that her tirade was being recorded by a local television news crew that was covering the fair. The footage of Margaret berating a farmer at a community event went viral on social media, with commenters mocking her entitlement and supporting my right to continue farming. The public relations disaster was the beginning of the end for Margaret's influence in the community. Several residents of Willow Creek Estates publicly criticized her handling of the situation, and a group of neighbors organized a recall petition to remove her from the HOA board. The development company that had hired her as a consultant quietly ended their relationship, and her real estate license was suspended, pending an investigation into her false statements about my property's development potential. Margaret tried to salvage her reputation by issuing a public apology, claiming that she'd been misled by incomplete information and that she deeply respected agricultural heritage. But the damage was done, and her credibility in the community was destroyed. The recall election was held 3 months later, and Margaret was removed from the HOA board by a vote of 73 to 12. The new board, led by Bob Martinez, and including several residents who'd grown up in the area, immediately rescinded all violations against agricultural properties and revised the community standards to explicitly protect existing farms and rural character. They also established a community garden program and began hosting an annual harvest festival to celebrate the area's agricultural heritage. Margaret quietly moved away a few months later, selling her house at a loss and relocating to a different state, where she presumably found a more receptive audience for her community improvement ideas. Today, my farm continues to operate as it has for over a century, protected by my great-grandfather's wisdom and foresight in establishing the agricultural easement. The red barn still stands proudly in the morning sun, the chickens still cluck contentedly in their coop, and the old stone well still provides crystal-clear water for the livestock. Tom Richardson and I have become close friends and allies, sharing equipment and supporting each other's farming operations. The Willow Creek Estates development has matured into a genuinely pleasant community where newcomers and longtime residents coexist respectfully, united by an appreciation for rural character and agricultural heritage. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of understanding property rights and the power of legal documents to protect against overreach. My great-grandfather's will wasn't just a distribution of assets. It was a vision for preserving the agricultural character of our land for future generations. Margaret's attempt to impose her vision of suburban perfection on our rural community ultimately failed because she underestimated the legal protections that existed and the community's attachment to its agricultural roots. Sometimes the best defense against bullies and would-be tyrants is simply knowing your rights and having the courage to stand up for them, even when the odds seem stacked against you.